We've been on a 3-day journey going through all the elements of IT that matter to you as IT professionals, but also to your business as technology takes a greater responsibility for the role that your business plays in its marketplace and the ability to be able to conduct the business it does. Day one was all about infrastructure, about modernizing the infrastructure and the journey that people are going on into the cloud. We had fantastic keynote presentations from Frank Denneman and Duncan Epping. You can go and view all of that content live in the replay section of this event. Yesterday then we moved on to the users and everything that was important to the users, from their devices, the applications they use, how you as IT professionals manage those devices, and the experience that we are giving the people that are using our devices. We spoke about the importance of changing the way that we have delivered those from the legacy of LAN-based technologies and the future of cloud-based technologies. And now today, possibly the most important section, security. How we make sure that we are going to be secure in this fragmented world where we as IT professionals need to have ultimate responsibility for ensuring that technology is secure inside our business. We've got fantastic content that will be available for you for the next 14 days. So as well as making sure your agenda is filled today with fantastic content from our professionals, go and have a look if you've missed content on the previous days to look at which sections will matter to you and your business. We've got a wealth of perks and prizes available to you. Today, Secureworks are giving away a Fortnum & Mason hamper if you watch 2 of their sessions. So you've got to watch 2 of their sessions to be within a chance of winning. So thank you ever so much, Secureworks, for that generous prize. For those of you that are watching this live stream and joining us this morning, we've got 50 Just Eat vouchers to give away today like we did yesterday and the day before. And don't forget, every session that you watch on Define Tomorrow will give you another entry into our tech bundle draw, including the DJI drone, an Oculus VR headset, and much more. This event wouldn't be possible without our sponsors that are here to help us on the journeys we're on with our customers, completing the solution against our main technologies, Dell, Microsoft, and VMware. Be sure to look at the content from these sponsors in the agenda to see how they could help you and your organization. So without any further ado, we're going to now be passing over to Rob Fluden from Secureworks, who is going to be looking at the incident response insights from 2020. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Barry. I'm assuming you guys can hear me just fine, loud and clear. Great, I'll keep going. So thank you for joining in today. My name is Rob Fluden, and I'm a director in incident response with the IR consulting team. Every year we create an annual report around what we've seen in previous years regarding incident response engagements. It primarily frames the cases we have worked and lessons learned from working them. This year we shifted that focus to be on the pandemic. Specifically, we wanted to highlight lessons learned and shifts to incident response because of the pandemic. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to highlight a few key items from our IR report. For example, no, we've not seen a major increase in the volume of attacks. However, we have seen a shift in tactics from threat actors capitalizing on the fear around COVID-19. Then there is the increased exposure some organizations have added because of their untested rapid movement to remote workforce. We've also ran into some interesting challenges over the year in responding to incidents, and I'd like to answer some of those questions. An example of such a question would be, what are some of the challenges with incident response during the pandemic? Last on the report portion, I'd like to talk about working with our customers, what we've seen in a few trends, and I think can help answer some questions like, what should we be doing differently to prepare for incidents with a remote workforce? After we talk about the IR report, I wanted to spend some time and provide an overview of a collection of opinions on what could be coming next, an interesting collection of opinions coming from a wide range of sources. Let's start with challenges early this year in the threat landscape. Early in the pandemic, it was first reported that the overall rate of attack was dramatically increasing. While it would be true to say we observed an increase in targeting COVID-19 related organizations, such as vaccine research and vaccine manufacturing organizations, we've not really seen a significant increase in attacks overall. Yes, attacks have increased, but not significantly. What we have seen is much closer to a pivot to launching COVID-19 themed campaigns, as well as exploiting gaps in security controls in emerging remote work environments. We've also seen a significant increase in the ratio of incidents with a strong uptick in ransomware. We maintain that while the risk and damage to organizations is high and increasing, the actual level of threat is remaining steady. Why? Because the attacks are successful due to gaps in basic security controls, such as patching, vulnerability management, and using multi-factor authentication. Thus, the threat itself is not specifically increased, whereas the impact has. And why is the impact increasing? It is our experience the shift to a remote workforce has increased the attack surface of organizations, creating a greater risk, and unfortunately at the same time, increasing basic security hygiene. Therefore, it's easier for the attackers to gain access. 5 of the top risks increased by moving to a remote workforce would include multi-factor authentication, VPN split tunneling, delays in patching, or even deploying default build systems without patching, changes in access controls, and changes in access to SaaS applications. Starting with multi-factor authentication, it is still a key security control. Our advice has not changed in years, and MFA is still on the top of the list. Having said all of that, I doubt this is the first time anyone's hearing this. But what is interesting is not so much the non-use of MFA, but other aspects surrounding it. For example, the unplanned absence of MFA, key systems, incorrectly setting up MFA, or delaying MFA deployment in order to increase the rollout of other services. So again, we are seeing MFA being used more, we're just seeing issues with this deployment. Next, VPN split tunneling is an issue where the system can connect via VPN or from the local network. Normally, organizations would allow a split tunnel in order to reduce the strain on corporate resources by allowing non-corporate traffic to go directly to the internet. However, it would be in a controlled manner and monitored. Unfortunately, this generally means a lack of visibility on traffic not going through the VPN. In one example this year, the initial attack vector was missed because the attack and subsequent command and control traffic went out directly to the internet unmonitored. It would have been detected had the traffic gone back out through the internally monitored egress point. In another example, eviction of the attacker had to be delayed to ensure shutting down the split tunneling, and it did not disrupt current operations for remote workers. Next, delays in security patching were superseded by operational priorities of internet-facing systems and remote access services. This means that even when organizations had deployed MFA correctly, adversaries were able to bypass it by using publicly available exploit code to compromise the underlying software or the hardware. Additionally, many security appliances, VPN concentrators, firewalls, and proxies were undersized for the remote workforce. This led to performance and usability issues, which encourages users to find alternative access methods, thus again reducing control and visibility of the sensitive data. Direct access to SaaS from remote users instead of going through the corporate VPN is an example of impeding visibility and logging. Additionally, last-minute changes in access control to SaaS applications increased difficulty in tracking authorized users, ensuring appropriate levels of access for users, and the auditing of users. In one case, a terminated system administrator continued to access remote resources, even though their corporate accounts were disabled. Putting a few of those items together, let's look at an example of a case we worked this year. I'd like to highlight a case we worked that involved the termination of a remote employee with privileged access. Prior to the pandemic, employees at the organization would physically return laptops or workstations. After receiving the computers, the IT team would eventually disable credentials. Thus, the risk was lower at the former employees no longer had access to the device, and access was controlled via the enterprise infrastructure. However, because this privileged employee was now working remotely, they delayed sending devices back to the office. As a result, we observed this employee using the company device and a personal device to access assets after termination. It turned out the former employee had multiple accounts with elevated access, both within the enterprise and externally on a critical SaaS system. Eventually, we discovered that some of this activity was done using a personal device, which meant we were unable to conduct forensics on that system in order to answer the most basic question: what did the former employee do? Next, let's look at a few things to consider regarding BYOD, or bring your own devices. The first thing to consider is potential for increased risk. One of the primary ways to address the risk is through policies and documented process guides for response. Organizations should be looking at creating or reviewing a few types of policies to include the use of personal devices in general, and then more specifically what they will do in a situation where the insider attacks originate on personal devices. Then there are a few technical controls to think about as well. For example, security of the system, security of the home router, security of Wi-Fi access, continual patching, and remote access. Also, organizations should consider how they can help the employee remediate these risks ahead of time. The worst case during an incident generally results in the isolation of the host, if that's even possible, and then stopping production of the employee. Considering this shift to remote workforce, incident response has been affected, and we have a few recommendations. Moving to incident response during the pandemic, we saw impacts to people, processes, and technology. With regards to people, we saw the service desk experience a surge in remote support required. We also saw a surge in access to additional resources like local printers requiring split VPN or opening access for USB ports, both of which are generally risky practices and also increased the surge on the remote support. With everyone being remote communication technologies and additionally even backup technologies are now required in BCDR plans. The assumption that people can just be on site in the same room should no longer be the default plan. With office closures and lockdowns occurring, some locations required the issue of travel permits before travel could even start. Additionally, configurations and change management was deprioritized and the need to address operational issues. This resulted in security control gaps, which normally would have been covered. In some situations, like the deployment of default systems, we saw a lack of understanding what the base system build should be, which also delays incident response. Regarding IR processes, we saw a need for changes to remote access, disk imaging processes, and rebuild processes for compromised systems. From a technology point of view, we saw issues with remote access around the need to remotely administer systems during an incident, and then having the right capabilities to actually conduct analysis. Data loss prevention tools were also being bypassed, resulting in incomplete logs, thus hampering investigations around data theft and impeding the ability to answer the question if critical data was stolen. Without EDR tools, identifying affected systems, conducting analysis, and remediation can be greatly impeded. Next, let's look at a case we worked that had some of these complications. Recently worked a case where the lack of an EDR tool almost led to a second ransomware infection at the tail end of the first. The organization had deployed new laptops to remote employees, but EDR software had not been part of the default installation. Unfortunately, a ransomware incident occurred on these fresh unprotected systems. Even after deploying an EDR tool, we were still incapable of reliably reaching all of the compromised systems in a reasonable time. Also, the customer did not have a remote management process in place. This resulted in initial containment being delayed. One endpoint, which was actively running malware, took weeks to remediate. This specifically, in turn, delayed in the second threat group, almost successfully deploying a second ransomware attack during the recovery efforts from the first incident. Clearly, this is a situation no one wants to be in. Now let's look at several issues we've discovered while responding during COVID to form our top recommendations. While we do have a number of standard recommendations that we make, like MFA, for example, is still our most common, we did pull forward a number that had been increasing because of the pandemic. These recommendations would include planning for a remote incident, updating BYOD policies, strengthening remote termination processes, revising remote help desk processes, planning for a secure transition to cloud services, and scaling capacity for remote connectivity. I like to look at two of these in a little more detail. First, I like to look at number 6 in more detail, update BYOD policies. Looking how organizations functioned before the pandemic, remote forensics was getting easier as our tools advanced. And more remote forensics at scale was a standard, especially for a large enterprise where all the devices were connected, managed, and owned by the enterprise. Thus, collecting evidence from geographically dispersed systems was normally not an issue. However, during the pandemic, we saw a shift in device management, ownership, accessibility, and data architectures. This was, of course, due to systems leaving the corporate premises and going home with the employees. We even have one story of people taking their office furniture home, especially the very comfortable office chairs. But lockdown has also resulted in the lack of access to systems because of office lockdowns, key staff out being unavailable, and even borders being closed. Thus, not all devices were immediately available. This lack of availability can dramatically increase the timeline of initial response and later remediation, possibly allowing persistence for a threat actor. With the rapid deployment to remote workforce, we saw personal devices become more prevalent, and like with any uncontrolled device, a number of security risks that were previously managed by the organization now must be managed by the end user as well. To complicate matters, if an investigation has to occur on a personal device, will the organization even be allowed to do it? We normally use a 3-party indemnity form for personal devices, but it all depends on the organization's guidance from their general counsel and the willingness of the employee to agree. To simplify the matter, The only real answer then becomes to just block access from that personal device, but that does not remediate the problem or the need for the employee to continue working. But what if you could remediate? Are you going to be able to rebuild personal devices? Probably not. There is a lot to think about in the BYOD policies. The other item I'd like to dive into is number 3, plan for remote incident response. IR providers have been working remotely for years now. This is something we are already doing. Secure communications is key in that work, especially since almost all communications will be remote. Secure communications is vital during the eviction process to keep communications secured from the threat actor. The threat actor is already in and likely already has access to normal communication channels. If the threat actor knows your timelines and steps for eviction, it will just make it that much easier to maintain access if they want to. Not all threat actors today are interested in maintaining access. And given that removing the threat actor might take a couple of attempts, the organization should take any advantage they can to increase their success with the eviction, especially securing their communications. So how do we establish secure communications during engagement? So during an incident, either the client already has secure communications or the IR provider will provide secure communications. We've worked with a number of external communication suites that allow for meetings, storing artifacts, live collaboration, and importantly, access from mobile devices. But getting that set up and ensuring only approved users make it into the environment is important with levels of restriction, just in case the threat actor does make it in. Make it impossible for them to then access everything immediately. And of course, this means it cannot rely on the likely compromised enterprise identity access management. It is important to note that once comms are compromised, other activities besides monitoring can happen. We've seen 2 interesting examples used by threat actors. The first in joining the meeting space and heckling the response team. While embarrassing, learning that your secure communications are not secure is actually helpful. The second and more devastating is a form of pre-authorized phishing. The threat actor will upload a weaponized document into the response team's channel. What happened next was the members of the response team opened the weaponized document and their systems were compromised. Our attack group actually uses this technique themselves. In one instance, they have an example of compromising 47 people within the first hour of doing this. So secure communications, especially now that most all communications will be happening remotely, is important to remote incident response. In conclusion for this section, I'd like to leave you with 3 key points. First, the threat landscape has shifted, but not dramatically increased. Second, our attack surfaces have expanded in unforeseen ways, and solutions will include a mix of people, processes, and technologies. Third, focus on the basics and plan for the long term. Get great at cyber hygiene. It is getting harder, but get great at it. And ensure your plans include increasing the security of your enterprise and your staff, even at home. Next, what I did is in preparation for this keynote, I went out and conducted a number of interviews around the organization, thinking about what could come next. We've included a lot of people in these interviews, from pre-sales all the way through incident commanders, red team, threat intelligence, et cetera, incident responders, researchers. So a nice big list of people that we've talked to. In the next section, I'm going to talk about things, and I might mention a few terms I wanted to clarify here. First, I might use the term CTU, that's our counter threat unit. And second, I might use our attack group or our adversary group, and that's SWAG, that's the Secureworks adversary group. This is our pen testers, red teamers, vulnerability assessment group. So what I wanted to do in light of this keynote is highlight some of the things we think might be defining tomorrow. So in 2019, the year before the pandemic, and the ensuing dramatic shifts in our attack surfaces, ransomware was just starting to pick up, and ransoms were mostly still below $1 million. The most common exploits, as reported by CISA, primarily targeted Microsoft systems and a few others, like Apache and Adobe. I don't think this surprises anyone, and we can all probably agree that there could be any number of reasons, including that is where the data is, these are the systems the business is using, or these are easy entry points, like end users. However, I don't think that is where all of our focus should remain going forward. In fact, some opinions I heard included warnings of over-focusing on the loud and noisy could be erasing indicators or something more complex occurring at a lower level. For example, if you are related to critical infrastructure, there's probably another group of threat actors, not specifically motivated by money, but rather motivated in maintaining access to your systems. These farmers could be in your systems for extended period of times. In some of our cases, we've seen examples of persistence or dwell time It's measured in years. Thus, let's talk about not so common attacks, but attacks that are still occurring and have been occurring for years, attacks against Linux systems. It is a common tool with many advanced threat groups, and they are often used to enter or move laterally through an environment. There's a long list of threat groups that have either moved from Linux to the MS environment, or for example, our red team likes to attack Microsoft systems that are managing Linux systems. Why? Because all the information you need to attack the Linux systems is usually kept on the Microsoft system that's managing the Linux systems. Therefore, it's safe to say that ignoring your Linux systems, because there's not a lot of news on them, is generally a poor idea. Leaning forward a little, we did not have anyone that thought the next massive attacks will be against Linux systems, but no one ruled it out either. So the question remains, will Linux eventually move into the widespread attack space or remain more reserved for the advanced threat groups? Also during the pandemic, we've seen the continuation of prior malware and associated tactics, techniques, and procedures. For example, continuation development of banking Trojans. They did not go away and they are still being developed and matured. Looking forward towards tomorrow, we see a phase we will likely be stuck in for a few years, a term called patch or punish. If you don't patch, you will be punished. Another common theme to patch or punish is low-hanging fruit. Patching has been a common issue for a very long time. Everyone I spoke to agreed that this will continue to be an issue in the future. Some of the issues that were identified revolved around things we have already seen over the past couple of years. For example, network devices, or more specifically home routers, have now become a standard part of the new required architecture. Two interesting points here that I want to focus on. One, management, who is managing them and patching them, etc. And even if they are being properly managed, are they actually secure? Two, they are generally Linux-based, and vendors have a history of not keeping available patches properly up to date. So when we looked at this, I then went out and did some more reading, got some more information, and I have two case studies I want to highlight briefly. A couple of these studies regarding the home routers have been conducted. The first in 2018 by the American Consumer Institute, or ACI, and latter in June of 2020 by the Fraunhofer Institute for Communications, or FKIE. So the first study looked at 186 routers from 14 different vendors, and they identified that 90% of the routers reviewed were Linux-based. It also confirmed that firmware and Linux OS updates were neither timely nor did they address the known vulnerabilities. So you could be patch compliant, thinking you have patched the known vulnerabilities, and yet the latest patches would not even address the known vulnerabilities. One system was found to have vulnerabilities going back 5 years. Thus, even with the latest updates, the systems were still vulnerable. Additionally, on average, each router tested had an average of 172 known vulnerabilities. Let me say that again, 172 known vulnerabilities, but that was 2 years ago. When we get to 2020, that number more than doubles. So ACI concluded back in 2018 that security is really only increased after high-profile attacks on routers, such as the VPN filter attacks. The more recent assessment, conducted in June of 2020 by FKIE, looked at a slightly smaller set of only 127 routers from 7 different vendors. Also, they discovered about 90% of the devices had Linux-based operating systems. First and most alarming, all routers had flaws. That is, all 127 routers had flaws. Worse, on average, there were 53 critical severity CVEs and 579 high severity CVEs. Interesting, a large number of these CVEs resulted from very old Linux kernels. Their initial findings indicated that about 40% of these devices had not had available updates in 378 days, or just over a year. Additionally, at least 1/3 of the devices were running a 9-year-old Linux kernel, 2.6.36. It received this last security update in 2016, or about 4 years ago. So if major security updates are provided only after high-profile attacks, we can start to see a cycle forming here. This cycle starts when the low-hanging fruit ripens and is plucked at scale. Keeping on the topic of Linux systems, briefly, there were some opinions that update management and monitoring, like EDR for Linux systems, is behind compared to Microsoft platforms. So again, Linux systems in and of themselves might be an interesting target in the next couple of years. Moving on to pre-vulnerable. This was a great concept that our adversary group uses, or SWAG uses. It's common in the cloud marketplaces to offer virtual machines. I don't think that's news to anybody. Unfortunately, not all of these VMs are maintained as well as they could be. Therefore, when you deploy the VM, you might be deploying a pre-vulnerable system right into your protected environment. Worse, our red team tracks a few of these and looks for them. If found, it's just a matter of executing their scan and exploit approach to get into the targeted environment. If our attack group is doing it, it's probably likely that others are doing it as well. Next, and interesting enough, SWAG also projected that they will be very successful over the next couple of years because of misconfigured MFA. I know it sounds odd that IR has been saying for years you need to get MFA, and in the very next breath, SWAG says we're going to use that to break into organizations. Because the implementation, MFA is being installed incorrectly, it's being ignored, or now we're seeing MFA bypass attacks as well. So IR has been saying it for years. It has been a standard for 20 years. We don't think that this issue is going to go away, unfortunately. So getting it secured right is probably going to be an issue for years to come. They also think they're going to be able to continue to bypass firewalls. There seems to be an issue in organizations where the policy they believe they've implemented in their firewall, in fact, is not actually implemented in their firewalls. Along with end users, there are a few things we think might not change very much in the near future. So everyone I spoke with, we all pretty much agreed that end users will continue to be a weakness for some time. A great quote from our adversary group: end users are the great equalizer against any security control. That door is not closing anytime soon. The team can always default to end user tricks to break into a targeted environment. A few of these tricks they currently like are smishing and authenticated phishing, also known as internal phishing. This is where an account is compromised, as we spoke about earlier, breaking into the MS team and uploading a weaponized document. With regards to MSS phishing or smishing, there was general consensus that the attack team likes it and the threat intel team sees it as a weak point for some time to come. Thus, we generally agree that end users need education on SMS usage, be aware of the various types of attacks like SMS swap attacks and SMS MFA fatigue attacks. Last, end users should try to avoid using authentication via MSS when possible. Also, there's this natural cycle that occurs where zero day is discovered, followed by some proof of concept code, which eventually becomes widely available, and then scan and exploit happens en masse. This is pretty much going to keep happening as well. And while the impacts can be far-reaching and damaging, it is not exactly what we are focusing on for this talk, but understanding this concept of this cycle is important as we see it later on in this presentation over the next couple of slides. And some things will change, but maybe not as fast as it feels. A great quote from Anders regarding the pace of change. I like to think that InfoSec has a lot of turbulence for very little current. Stay away a week and it feels like you're completely lost touch. Stay away a year and it's all the same. But things do change. Something we are seeing more of is the use of Golang or Go and the use of C#. We had agreement that Go is becoming more popular, but we had a couple of different reasons as to why. The first reason is the possibility of those entering the workforce are coming with the Go C# skill sets versus Python PowerShell skill sets. Another viewpoint suggested that the shift to Go was because on two key items. First, every EDR in the world is looking for PowerShell, so doing anything in PowerShell today has a decent chance of being detected. The second item is that Go is portable between operating systems, thus write once and use on multiple operating systems. Either way, our attack teams are writing in Go today, as well as the threat groups. Next is this concept of ransomware as a service. As this broadens out, the bar to entry will continue to lower. We had a few opinions on this, most likely circling around becoming more aggressive. So previously, dwell time for post-intrusion ransomware has been measured in days. However, we have seen recent incidents where they've occurred over 5 hours from post-intrusion to full deployment of ransomware, and even one reported recently under 45 minutes by Microsoft. Additionally, as threat groups become more aggressive, like we saw the move from ransomware no data theft to eventually shift into ransomware name and shame, we think more aggressive behaviors will emerge. Looking beyond evolution and shifting to what types of attacks we might see next. Generally speaking, there's a set of conditions that we think need to be available in order for this to be high targeted items that will happen in mass or at scale. The first, the data being targeted needs to be rich or extensive data set. The overall approach being compromised needs to be generally easy. The attack needs to be automatable. It needs to happen at scale and with speed. Generally, we all agree that IAM is going to be the security control going into the future. And then if we combine the next three, cloud platforms, collaboration tools, and virtual apps, it's generally more about the numbers and the centralization versus diversification. So in short, there's rich data, it's automatable, it's scalable, and then it's just sitting there waiting for the easy to access to happen. Recall again, that's the 0-day exploit cycle, the easy to access. Briefly touching on continuous integration and continuous development pipeline. Multiple studies and research papers have been conducted on this topic, specifically the security of this over the past couple of years, as well as some internal research conducted by our Counter Threat Unit, or CTU. The CI/CD introduces ongoing automation and continuous monitoring through the software lifecycle. It is used from integration and testing to delivery and deployment. Recent studies by groups like Synopsys and 451 Research indicate there are multiple challenges within the workflows themselves. For example, non-automated security testing tools, slowed workflows, etc. In short, there's a lot of exposure in the attack surface for an organization using CI/CD has increased, and a lot of trust has to happen along the whole automation workflow. To wrap this slide up, I just want to remind you that these are just a collection of opinions. Next, I'd like to talk about a few key things to think about on the now from our incident commanders. So I have 6 items to briefly highlight. Notice again, the first item we were talking about is MFA. The good news is that we are talking about better ways to address MFA, which means we are seeing it being used. However, there are issues with MFA being understood and implemented correctly. Incident commanders wanted us to highlight that and bring that home again. Second challenge is service accounts. When compromised, a number of things could go wrong with service accounts. For example, they are shared. Often the passwords have not been updated in some period of time, etc. Incident commanders again ask that we point out that if you have not done an inventory of your service accounts, please do so. They also suggested investigating ways to manage service accounts, for example, GMSAs or group managed service accounts. Item 3, the ability to codify business impacts. The ICs find that some organizations have a hard time defining and describing actual risks, priorities, and timing of activities to summarize the potential business impacts. Being able to do this will better inform decision makers and assist the uplift so badly needed from researching tactically to devising a long-term strategic plan for recovery. Backups, like MFA, we all know about them and we all know what to do. However, the ICs are still running into issues when working major incidents. They ask that you strongly consider running a backup exercise and to include considerations for VMs and air-gapped or non-writable solutions. Item 5, asset visibility. Remains an issue, and the ICs are still running into it. Lacking asset visibility has led to delays in resolving root cause. We see story after story where days, weeks, months have gone by, and we find a tip to some system that everyone forgot about, or worse, some domain no one knew existed any longer. Once we get visibility onto the system or into the domain, our investigations tend to progress quite rapidly. Last but not least, ensuring understanding of the underlying assets for critical services. Too many times we have seen incidents where systems is years past end of life support and is still running because no one really understands it, yet it provides some key aspect and some key business function. During a major incident is not the time to try to sort out what equipment does what job for which key services. So in closing, the ICs wanted me to share 6 things to think about doing today. Again, they were implement MFA and use group policies, understand and manage your service accounts, be able to codify business impacts from an incident, secure and test your backups, ensure visibility of assets, and ensure there is an understanding of underlying assets. Thank you for your time and questions if we have them.
I think it is really eye-opening to understand what people are seeing in the real world that are seeing these challenges happen every day. So what really stood out to me there is an element that kind of was back to some of the other presentations that we've had during the week. The first was the 3 R's that we've been on this journey through COVID that was mentioned by Spencer Pitts on Workspace Transformation Day. That we kind of were at that respond phase during the coronavirus pandemic or at the start of it. We're now in that reflect phase before you then have to get to that rethink phase. And I think much of what Rob was saying there around the changes that had to be made to make people working, and also what you have heard the increasing threat response or the increasing threats will be, is we need to rethink the way that we're protecting our organization and make sure that we are protected to in such a way that can protect a fragmented set of resources, fragmented set of data, and fragmented set of users. The next area that I want to reflect on is good cybersecurity hygiene. Just looking at the brilliant basics that we need to be doing, such as patching your systems, reviewing who has administrator access, and many more. These are things that really we should be doing every day. They should be a top priority. But time and time again, they do end up being the element that ends up catching out organizations. We heard in Rob's presentation about the increase in bring your own device. And lots of organizations, when I ask them what is their BYOD policy, say they don't have one. They don't allow people to bring their own device. We give people a device. And as we will have heard in my keynote presentation yesterday, this is rarely a good response. This is rarely realistic, because even if you don't allow people to use devices, even if you give your employees another device, they will still pick up the device that works for them to allow them to be productive at a specific time. And finally, the element I want to reflect on is the importance of incident response. We hear lots of organizations considering DR and what to happen if there is a fire or a plane flies into our building. But how many of us have actually planned what should happen if there is a cyber attack in our business? This is critical. This could be the difference between a massive loss of data and big costs and the knock-on effects to your business, or being able to get up and running quickly and easily. I highly recommend that you consider your incident response. Have a chat with your Computer World account manager, how we and Secureworks can help you with managed services around incident response. So thank you ever so much, Rob, for the presentation. Computer World, we deliver a variety of security products and services to help you get the most out of your environment and ultimately to ensure that it is protected. We recommend that organizations start with an audit or looking into the environment to make sure that you understand actually where are your risks inside the environment. Once you understand where those risks are, you're best able to plan as to the remediation you need to take place to have the biggest effect to minimize those risks. We're able to help with security hardening, certification like Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. We ourselves are Cyber Essentials Plus certified and an assessor. We also meet ISO 27001 standards. We've got a large variety of technologies in the security space to help you with patching, firewalls, antivirus, threat detection, auditing, and much far beyond. So make sure you have a chat with your Computer World account manager to understand how we can help you. And if you head over to computerworld.co.uk/DT security, you'll be able to fill in a form there to meet with one of our specialists to discuss your security needs. Thank you ever so much for joining this keynote and for joining the previous 2 days if you joined in as well. At Computer World, we specialize in the areas that we focused on during this 3-day conference. Infrastructure modernization, everything your users do not care about until it goes wrong. And we're on the modernization journey, taking the infrastructure to the cloud and beyond. Next is workspace transformation, everything the users use day in, day out. We've got radicalization as to what needs to happen for us to be able to manage and maintain that, as well as improving productivity, collaboration, and communication inside your organization. And finally, as we're hearing all about today, security and protection, making sure in this new flexible, fragmented world that your data is secure. We offer a wide variety of services such as architecture, consultancy, support desk, training, and much more. So get in touch with your Computer World account manager if we can be of assistance for you. I hope you enjoy the rest of Define Tomorrow. Make sure you go and check the schedule. And next up, we've got the security panel session, which I highly recommend. And then next, looking at some of the trends you should be looking at for 2021. Thank you for watching.